Hello, Tungsten Miner here. This is part 2 of a series on Advanced Rocketry version 2.0. This time we're going to talk about what it takes to actually get a satellite up into space. So let's go. Okay, to start out, we know we're going to need a rocket, but I want to rewind a little bit from the rocket part to say, where does the rocket fuel come from? And the reason for that, of course, is that you're going to need a fair bit of rocket fuel and it takes a while to make it. So it's best to get that production line going before you jump into building the rocket itself. So what we're looking at here are a combination of machines that allows us to do that. This guy is an electrolyzer. It expects water as input in the back here, and you can't quite see it, but there's a little plug similar to this, different color, that tells you it's expecting water as, or any kind of fluid as an input in here. When the machine is running, and I will turn it on now, you can see that little electrical zappy guy over there, and that is going to electrolyze the water and turn it into hydrogen and oxygen. And you can see I've got some fluid in the pipe here. That's the hydrogen, and the blue over there is the oxygen. That is getting pumped into this machine over here, the chemical reactor. And the chemical reactor is able to take the oxygen and the hydrogen and re-react it together again to get you rocket fuel. So I've already made some rocket fuel over here. You can see it's the yellow fluid in there. And this guy is, we'll turn him back on, going to make some noise, and it's going to consume the tank with hydrogen, and it's going to consume the other tank with oxygen, and between the two of them it's going to wind up producing rocket fuel. And it seems a little funny perhaps to say I'm going to start with water, break it into two fluids, combine the same two fluids, and wind up with a different thing as the output, but go look up the chemistry. This actually works out. Anyway, one other thing to notice here, first is power. I've created these with the Creative Power input plug, which of course is only available when you're playing in Creative, which I am. This is a tutorial, but if you're doing this in a survival world, you're going to wind up making a regular power input plug here and have to plug things in yourself and generate power from however you choose to do that. Maybe you've got some solar panels set up or a coal generator, or maybe you've just got some other mod that does that for you. The other thing I'll point out, of course, is that I'm using fluid ducts from thermodynamics. Advanced Rocketry does not provide power, fluid, item, ducts, logistics pipes, any of that sort of thing. So you're going to want to package this in a mod pack with something that does provide those things if you want to hook things up as I have done here. So I've now got a pretty simple closed system that produces rocket fuel. So let's move on and see what we can do with it. Actually, before we move on and see what we can do with it, I want to make a short pit stop and talk about some of the options you're going to face, because it actually will change which of those machines you wind up deciding to make. So over here we have a monopropellant rocket engine with a monopropellant fuel tank. This is the simpler configuration, and what it expects is just plain old rocket fuel, which is what we've got in this bucket here, which is, of course, the output we got in that tank over there. So when you're thinking about what kind of rocket do you want to build and how do you want this to work, you make your monopropellant rocket engine if you want to just keep it simple. One engine, one tank, one kind of fuel, one fuel loader, just the whole supply pipeline gets a lot simpler down the road. But there's a reason you might want to use a bipropellant rocket engine, which has a bipropellant fuel tank, which holds hydrogen, and an oxidizer fuel tank. And these are actually two separate kinds of tanks. And in fact, all three of these are different tanks. So the recipe here for monopropellant, bipropellant, and oxidizer, very similar, of course, just where is that steel sheet in the middle. But they are three different kinds of tanks which hold three different kinds of fluids. So you've got rocket fuel here, you've got hydrogen here, and you've got oxygen here. So the reason to use one or the other, eventually down the road, you're going to find yourself making a spacesuit. And the spacesuit is going to want oxygen to keep the player alive. It's also got a rocket pack that you can attach to it, which allows you to then fuel it with hydrogen and fly around in space. So at some point, you may find it's worth the extra infrastructure of dealing with two different kinds of fluids, different fluid loaders, different tanks, more complicated rockets, the whole thing, in order to be able to keep oxygen and hydrogen available at all times and not tie up a bunch of it in the rocket fuel itself. Apart from that difference, though, there's really nothing else to fuss about. Both engines give you the same thrust, both engines work pretty much the same way. So really the only difference is, do you find that you want to keep the hydrogen and oxygen separate so you can use them in your spacesuit? Or would you rather not fuss about it and just combine them into rocket fuel and use that as it is? Okay, sidetrack over. Let's get on with things. Okay, so we started this out by saying we're going to make a data satellite and launch it into space. Well, this is how you do that. What we're looking at here actually is a multi-block machine, so it's not just one block on top of another. It really is a multi-block machine. However, as you can see, it's just 2 blocks, so very simple. You've got some kind of power input plug. I'm using the creative one. And on top of that, you've got the satellite builder, and then you assemble the whole thing like any other multi-block by clicking on the satellite builder. And then the second time you click on it, you'll get this interface. So what we're looking at here is how you put together all the pieces in order to have a functional satellite. So what you put in here is the chassis. There's just an empty chassis that has no parts attached to it. Here, you're going to put a satellite chip, which is going to be encoded with the ID of the particular satellite that you're making. And every single satellite is going to have its own ID. This combination allows you to copy the satellite chip, so you can have more than one chip with the same ID, which refers to the same actual satellite up in space. And in fact, it's super important that you make at least one copy and keep one of them safe somewhere. Otherwise, you will have no way to access that satellite in the future. All this stuff over here are the places to put the parts that go onto the satellite. So this top corner is going to depend upon the kind of satellite you're making. So we're making a data satellite today, so we're going to put some kind of sensor in this corner over here. But there's a bunch of other kinds, and whatever you put here determines the kind of satellite. Along here and down here are the places to put cargo, basically, or the modules that you add to your satellite. And while they do have specific things kind of indicated, so obviously kind of power and data down here, you can actually kind of mix and match and put different things in any of those places. All right, over here, I've got some parts. So here's our satellite chassis, and you notice it's just an empty chassis, nothing going on. I've made myself 2 satellite ID chips, kind of the bare minimum that you should make. And then the rest of these are actually the modules that you use for making a data satellite that is looking for distance data. So how far away is an asteroid? Now you'll notice I've got 2 different configurations here. They both need an optical sensor and they both need at least one data storage unit. But your satellite needs power. So you can either get power using a basic solar panel, which requires 3 gold plates and some glowstone and redstone. And that will give you enough power to run the satellite. You need 3 of them or you won't have enough power to do all of the functions that the satellite has to do, and you won't wind up getting any data back again. However, if you want to get the most data possible, you can provide large solar panels, and actually quite a lot of them, so you can get up to 4 of them. These guys are made up of 6 basic solar panels and provide 6 times the power, as you would expect, of course, at 6 times the cost. So these get to be pretty expensive. But if you're providing that much power, the satellite can collect data that much faster. You can also store more data because you've got a total of 6 slots by providing 2 different data storage units. So I'm going to grab all of these parts and we will go over to our satellite builder. So first off, put the chassis in. I'm going to take one of the chips, drop it in there. Going to take my optical sensor and put it in the kind slot. Power, power, power. Drop the last one down there. And then finally fill in the data storage units. And over here, I can say build. And after a little while, I will get my satellite back again, and you can see it no longer says empty satellite chassis, but this is an optical telescope. And it's got a fair bit of data storage and power generation and data storage and so forth. So you get an idea of what kind of satellite we're dealing with exactly here. So I'm going to take that out. And now I want to make a copy of this chip, ID 0. So I'm going to drop this in here, and then I'm going to click on this button. And it's going to go through a quick process here. And eventually I'll get out a second satellite ID chip. So now I've got my satellite and I've got my 2 ID chips, so I know exactly what the satellite is. And for safekeeping, I'm going to leave one of these over here, and I'm going to keep one with me. Okay, so now let's talk about building the rocket. The first thing you're going to need is a launch pad. So the launch pad itself is not too complicated. Just some concrete with some dye, recipe for concrete. And this is a special Advanced Rocketry concrete, so it's not the vanilla Minecraft concrete, but this is how you make it. So not too complicated. It does get a little inconvenient to get all that dye. That's about the only thing. So you might want to keep your launch pad fairly small, scaled to the size of rocket that you're going to want to make. Now over here, it's important to point out, I've got my launch pad blocks on this plane, and I've got this structure tower, which is also necessary. And it starts on the same plane as the launch pad. So you notice it's on the same level down here. This is important. It's actually will not form this launch pad structure correctly if you don't do this. And it's an easy thing to overlook. So be sure you've got this bottommost bit of the structure tower level with the bottom of the launch pad. These can be any size you want. It depends entirely on how big of a rocket you actually want to make. So I've scaled these down to be fairly small for demonstration purposes. But if you want to build a gigantic rocket, then just expand these things and make them bigger. Same thing with the structure tower. They need to be at least as tall as your rocket because that's what the blocks will be scanned for to find out what's going on. And anything that winds up in this 3-dimensional space defined by the area of the launch pad and the height of the tower will be considered part of your rocket when you wind up ultimately building it. Rocket parts. Well, you can use anything you want, literally no limitations at all. However, there are some things you must include. You must have some kind of engine, and we talked about the different kinds, so at least one kind of engine. You gotta have a fuel tank that's appropriate for the sort of engine you're using. You need a guidance computer or the rocket won't know where to go. And since we are trying to launch satellites, we'll need to include a satellite bay. Now, there are a couple of other jobs you can do with rockets. If they don't involve satellites, you don't need the satellite bay. And then finally, I happen to use structure tower blocks to fill in the bits of the rocket, but it's completely optional. Use whatever you want. So let me grab some of these. And let's try building the smallest possible rocket we can conceive of. That's it. That's the whole thing, 4 blocks. So right here, I've got a rocket assembling machine. It does require power, so I've thrown in an energy cell under there. And let's scan our rocket. So you can see the green bars come down. They're going to be looking for any blocks that are in that volume. And now it's going to tell me what it thinks about my rocket. Not enough fuel capacity. So we can see I've basically got no fuel capacity at all. It's just too tiny of a tank. So I'm going to include another fuel tank here. And we can say scan again. You can see it's doing its work by this little progress indicator. And now we're a little bit better along. So we've got more than 0 millibuckets of fuel per second for the launch, but it's still not enough fuel. So let's add a little bit more fuel. Okay, doing better, but not quite there. So rather than continuing this process, let's just go ahead and build a rocket that is a little bit more capable. throw this in at the top, and we'll give this a scan. So now it's going to find all of those blocks that I have added, and clear for liftoff. I happen to know, because I played around with this ahead of time, that this is kind of the smallest rocket you're actually going to be able to get away with and still be able to carry the payload that we need to carry. So, great, fine. Cleared for takeoff. So now I'm going to build this rocket. Changes to red bars. That's how you know it's building instead of just scanning. And you noticed it moved the rocket? Because this is now actually an entity, like a boat or a horse is an entity. This is no longer just a collection of blocks. It is a full-on rocket. And if I do a scan now, we can see missing guidance computer. So it detects no blocks on the pad because this is no longer a block. It is an entity, which we can now interact with by right-clicking. So here we can see we've got the guidance computer. There's normally a place to put a chip here to say where you want to go. Not relevant to us at the moment. You've also got a satellite bay, so let's stick our satellite in the satellite bay. And now we've loaded up our rocket with our satellite. At this point, we could send it off, except there's a few things we need to do first. Well, first of all, we need to fuel the thing up. So you'll notice I've got this device called a linker here, pretty simple to make. And what it does is if you, whoops, there we go, shift right click on the fueling station, program linker, fueling station, and I'm going to shift right click on the rocket assembly machine, linked successfully. You can now see this teeny tiny thread of a line, just barely, that connects from our fueling station over to the rocket. And we can see this is still full because I've got a creative tank here. But when I click on the rocket, we can see it is slowly fueling up all of the tanks in the rocket all at once. And once it gets full of fuel, we'll be able to actually start thinking about sending this thing off. But how do you do that? Well, there's one more device we got to worry about, and that is our rocket monitoring station. So I'm going to link that the same way. Shift, right click, and then I'm going to click on my rocket assembly machine, right click, sorry, shift, right click, link successfully. So now this guy recognizes I've got fuel, velocity is 0, we're not going up, we're not going down, altitude is on the ground, and everything is pretty much ready to go because we're all fueled up. We've got our satellite in there. Everything's great. So let's click launch. Except nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? Well, we don't have a destination. Nope, I was wrong. There it goes. Just took a little while. So for certain missions, you need a planet ID chip, but for satellites, you don't because they're going to orbit basically the planet that you're currently on. So off our rocket goes, and we're just going to wait a little while for that rocket to get up into space. Now this mission progress thing down here, one word on that. We are just launching a satellite into orbit. So you can see velocity is maximum, altitude is creeping up. Once it gets to the top, the satellite will get launched. The mission progress, though, actually is specifically referring to harvesting asteroids. So when you send off a rocket to go harvest asteroids, it will eventually, once it gets past this top altitude here, tell you the mission time here, and it will start counting down as it's going through the different pieces of the mission. Yeah, and at this point, it's no longer tracking the rocket, so that's why all of this stuff is kind of reset itself. But if we wait a little bit, we'll eventually see it come back down again. But it does take a little while. So we're going to move on and talk about this next machine. In fact, the last one for this video. This is the satellite terminal. So when you stick your satellite chip in here, it connects to your satellite in orbit, and starts figuring out what's going on. And eventually it'll start reading everything out once the satellite is launched, which obviously, despite the rocket not being back, ours has been. And it gives you kind of a status reading on what's going on with the rocket. So optical telescope, it's fully powered, no problem, lots of data storage. It's got 2 pieces of data in there right now. And as we wait, we'll see it'll get up to 3 and then 4 and 5 and so forth. It's a slow process. But what it's doing is it's gathering data about asteroids in the local system. And as it collects that data, it will actually become useful in future projects where we're going to ultimately do a mission to harvest asteroids. So this is really the first step of doing that. And that's kind of it for this video. So things we have covered. We talked about producing fuel for rockets with your electrolyzer, and then if you want, in your chemical reactor, turn it into rocket fuel. Then we chatted about the difference between monopropellant fuel and bipropellant fuel, or bipropellant engines. And then we covered building a satellite using the satellite builder, launching our first rocket, making a launch pad, and using the rocket assembly machine to build the rocket itself. Talked a bit about the different parts that you need to have in order to build your rocket successfully. We then talked about the linker and connecting the fuel station up to the rocket assembly machine, which allows it to fuel your rocket. Talked about using the rocket monitoring station to be able to launch an unmanned mission. And then finally, we talked about the satellite terminal, which allows us to monitor the status of the rocket and to connect to download all of the data into this machine itself. And then in the future, we'll get to what do you actually do with the data once you've got it. So that's it for now. Talk to you next time.